Thanks a lot, and also for this invitation and this opportunity to come to Greece, which, as you will see from my presentation, I consider still to be one of perhaps the central player in the debate on the European level on the future of EU border and migration and asylum policy. We've already heard from both previous speakers that there is still a crisis. It has at least 4 dimensions in Europe. We have a dramatic humanitarian crisis in the central Mediterranean. Last year, more people drowned than ever before. At least 4,500 people drowned just on the way from North Africa to Italy, 4,500. And this despite a record number of rescues. Last year, more people arrived in Europe from North Africa than ever before. And just to, again, remind you, this year, the first 2 months of the year, it is more people than the first 2 months of last year. Nothing the European Union is currently discussing or doing looks like it is working in North Africa. And so while we are saving 99%, and this is very important, the key policy fact is this, that of the 181,000 people that from North Africa reached the European Union and European boats, including NGOs, have actually rescued 99%. So the policy dilemma for the European Union is this. People are leaving North Africa in tiny boats, boats that cannot reach Europe. They are being picked up at sea. And the question for the European Union is, well, legally it is obliged, there is no other choice under the Refugee Convention and EU law, to then take them to the EU. So the question is, in fact, what is the irregular migration here? It's the EU picking up people in the sea and taking them to the EU. Almost nobody would reach Italy in those boats. Now this is, and as I said, it doesn't work very well. Still, thousands of people drown. The second crisis, of course, is in Greece, where we've heard the numbers. It cannot be compared to 2015, and yet you all know that when you go to the Greek islands, the situation is really shameful for Europe. The islanders are extremely unhappy, and the whole agreement is unnecessarily fragile, and I'll talk about this in a second. But there is a second problem with the Greek situation, which is that much of Europe, many EU capitals consider Greece to be solved. It's now a Greek problem. And I think that is an illusion, that's dangerous. And it's one of the issues for Greece to propose and put on the table solutions. And I think the best way to do that is to put on the table solutions not just for Greece, but for the whole Mediterranean, based on its experience. Thirdly, we've already heard about the Dublin reform debate in Europe. Well, my suspicion, my strong sense talking to people in Brussels is this debate is going nowhere. This isn't surprising because the basic problem is very difficult. Dublin never worked. If you look at the number of transfers under Dublin back to the countries where people first arrived, they were always extremely low, every single year. So of those requested, if I look at the numbers of reported transfers between 2010 and 2015, on average each year it was between 13,000, 17,000 a year. And just to give you an example, in one of these years 150,000 were requested. So Dublin never really worked, but the reform debate in Brussels and in capitals is going in the direction of making it harder for people to leave the first country of reception. So the real debate in Dublin at the moment is not about how to help Greece or Italy, but how to make it harder for people to leave Greece and Italy. Which is why Italy has no real interest in this debate being concluded in the next few months, which is why I hear from the Maltese presidency that nothing's going to happen as long as they have the presidency. Now, my suspicion is, also talking to European parliamentarians, this debate is going to produce pretty much the consensus, which is a non-functioning Dublin system, and that's not good. And fourthly, we have what already Miltiades Vavitsiotis described, the political crisis. It's not just Europe, it is the United States. I just spent 10 days in the US, where it is very likely that the US migration and refugee policy of the last decades is going to be dismantled by this administration. We don't know how much funding will be cut to UNHCR or the ICRC, But we do know that essentially the US role in resettlement is very likely ending. And the US was the biggest country resettling refugees from UNHCR. So this creates a huge gap. I don't talk about Europe, we have experts on populism. Just to say, I don't think we can be happy because from time to time an election ends in a good way. Okay, in Austria, the far right didn't win. But it came within a few thousand votes of winning. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders might not be the next prime minister. But if he is first or second, that is actually dramatic, given his program. And in France, Le Pen might not be president this time. But if she's in the runoff, this is actually a dramatic signal for Europe. So the political crisis that we've already heard about is not over. So what is needed? Let me be very concrete. We need a European policy on our borders and on asylum that works, and work means that it is both humane, legal, effective, and politically viable. It needs to be able to be defended by parties that want to win elections. If we have policies that cannot be politically viable, that no government or no party will run on in elections, we will not get them. It's wishful thinking. At the same time, it needs to be legal and humane. It needs to work fast, and that means, since the EU treaties will not change, it needs to be in compliance with the Refugee Convention and European law on asylum. Is such a policy possible? I suggest that it is. And I suggest that it could be implemented right now, both in Greece and in the central Mediterranean. And here is how it could work. It would be based on 5 principles, 4 no's and 1 yes. The no is, first of all, no pushbacks. Well, that should be clear. That's just the Refugee Convention. Article 33 says, Europe will not push people back into potential danger. That's the core, non-refoulement of international refugee law. And that means everybody we pick up in the central Mediterranean cannot be taken to a country like Libya, cannot be taken to a country that doesn't guarantee basic security and the chance to apply for protection. That means a lot of the debates currently on the table in some EU capitals about perhaps putting people somehow back to North Africa as a deterrent are going to be illegal. They are also extremely impractical. They are not going to work because we don't have a single country in North Africa prepared to do it. But we shouldn't even discuss it because it sends the wrong signal. So no pushbacks. Secondly, no Nauru. No Nauru, which is the Australian solution. What is Nauru? Nauru is the idea that you deter arrivals by basically indefinite detention. So you detain people, you say, yes, you can apply for asylum. People in Nauru can apply for asylum. It just takes years, unnecessarily, because there are very few people on Nauru. There were never more than 1,500 people on this tiny island in the Pacific. And yet it takes years to resolve their cases. And then when they get refugee status, they are still stuck on Nauru because nobody takes them. Now, during those years, they also are treated very badly, which of course is policy. Don't tell me that you cannot provide decent accommodation for 1,000 or 1,400 people. The reason these conditions are bad is to deter arrivals. Europe should not embrace such a policy. Again, there is also a practical reason. Besides the moral and legal arguments, the practical reason is we don't have a Nauru. We don't have a Guantanamo where President Clinton put Haitians that arrived by boat, or Cubans in 1994, 20,000 he put in Guantanamo. But listen what happened with President Clinton's policy to put the Cubans in Guantanamo. A few months later, well, they were still there, and the US decided, well, let's take them all to the US, naturalize them, and by now they're all US citizens. It didn't work. Thirdly, we should have a policy of no drownings. I mean, we should make a much bigger effort to save lives. And I think in the central Mediterranean, one really needs to look closely. The idea that we can turn this over to the Libyan Coast Guard is a fantasy. Anybody who knows Libya knows this is a fantasy. But this leaves us with the dilemma, how do we control our borders? If we do not do pushbacks, if we do not want to deter people by treating them badly, and if we do want to save them, and here is the key to everything. We need to be able to decide on who is a refugee and who is a migrant within the shortest possible time. It is extremely irrational that it takes at the moment more than a year in Italy for the average case of asylum to be resolved. And we've seen how a very small number on the Greek islands, many of these people who've arrived have not yet seen an asylum case officer. If we would be able, and this is not a legal problem, it's a problem of logistics and organization, if we would be able to conclude an asylum procedure within 4 weeks, with a first and a second instance decision, with enough caseworkers, translators, legal aid, and appeals panels, enough people to decide within 4 weeks if a Nigerian who arrives or is brought to Italy requires protection from Boko Haram or is not in need of protection, which in fact 80% of Nigerians who arrive in Italy are found to be not in need of protection, but it takes 2 years. And then we find a way to return the people not in need of protection immediately, the numbers of people arriving would fall very, very fast. You would still get people arriving, we would still treat asylum cases, we would not push people back, we would try to decide fast, but the number of people arriving, because in North Africa, in fact, most of the nationalities that arrive there are refugees among them, but if you look at the recognition rates to give protection under the UN Convention, it is usually around 10, 15, 12% for most of the nationalities who arrive. Now, on the Greek islands, that's exactly the policy we would need as well. A fast, quality process to determine for whom it is safe to be returned to Turkey. And those who are not returned to Turkey, and here is the key innovation we need, should be relocated immediately as recognized refugees in Europe. This would be a European policy that would address a whole range of our problems. Imagine this. We would have EU missions that are funded by the EU, that are invited. In fact, I think Greece should demand this. Greece should go to Brussels or Berlin or The Hague or Paris and say, we demand that the European Union sets up a credible EU mission, that this is a European external border, that it guarantees that there are quality decisions and that they are fast. We want that there is nobody on kiosk by the end of this year, and by the summer, by the beginning of the tourist season, we want Suda camp to be closed and less than 1,000 people on the island. How do we achieve this? If we have enough caseworkers, if everybody who is rejected or who is found to be safe in Turkey is immediately returned to Turkey, and if everybody else is immediately relocated in Europe. And relocation just needs to be slightly reformed in the sense that anybody who's found to be in need of protection, regardless of nationality, should be relocated in Europe, not just a few countries. That's why it's so slow in Italy, because most of the people who arrive in Italy don't qualify for relocation. I mean, they are from countries that are currently excluded, even if they are found, the individual is found to need protection. So here is the outline for a credible EU policy. EU asylum missions in Greece and Italy. An Italian-Greek initiative demanding this from the European Union so that, in fact, this should replace Dublin. Why do we need Dublin if 90% of arrivals arrive in Greece and Italy? And if all of them who need protection are relocated from Greece and Italy within 4 weeks? Then we don't have this phenomenon of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people moving around Schengen, giving the far right an argument against Schengen borders, open borders, erring around, waiting for years, sometimes being transferred, most of them never being transferred anyways. If everybody can be quickly decided, this also means that the EU needs to create decent reception conditions. I think, again, Greece and Italy should call on the EU to take responsibility for this. This is an issue of management. And this gets me to two final concrete points. In order for this to work, we, of course, need agreements with countries that take people back. We have an agreement with Turkey. There's been no problem. Turkey says, whoever you decide is safe here, we take them back. What we need, however, is transparency and clarity that just meets the criteria of the European Court of Human Rights, that in each individual case we know what happens to the people we send back. For this we need just a mechanism. It's not enough for the Commission to say, we sometimes go to Turkey and see and it looks okay. There should be a permanent body, an ombudsperson appointed by Turkey and the EU, who should give a guarantee that every single case of people being sent back, we know what happens to them. The United States was able to do that with Cuba when it returned people, and they didn't even have diplomatic relations. Secondly, in North Africa, we cannot return people to North Africa, so we need take-back agreements with countries of origin. Angela Merkel has recently traveled to Egypt, to Mali, and now she's in Tunisia. These are the wrong countries to visit. She should go to Nigeria, Senegal. She should go to Gambia and Mali, Morocco and Ivory Coast. In January, the people who arrived in Italy were from Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Senegal, Gambia, Mali and Morocco. Most of these are countries with 10% recognition rates under the Refugee Convention in Europe. Some of them more get subsidiary protection. We need to make agreements on taking citizens back with these countries. And there we need to offer something. And here is my last point. We need to be strategic. We can't have illusions about sending people back. Italy, over the last few years, never managed, when I'm talking about forceful return of people who had been rejected as refugees, where all the legal process was exhausted, Italy never managed in a year to send back more than a few thousand people, a year. So readmission needs to be strategic. It needs to be of those who arrive after a certain date. Because only if we can show that every Nigerian who arrives after the 1st of April in Italy, who is found within 4 weeks not to need protection, is then immediately returned, then the number of new arrivals will fall dramatically. So if we manage to put this together, all of this is doable. This would be a humane, effective EU asylum policy. It should be based on an initiative from Greece and Italy to the Maltese presidency. It would take care of the Dublin debate, and it would show the world that Europe is able to combine respect for the Refugee Convention, saving lives, with effective control of its borders.